At home, the excitement was palpable. The photographer loaded a roll of film and headed to a nearby park. They captured serene landscapes, towering trees, and an empty bench by the water. Everything seemed ordinary until the film was developed. In one photo, a faint, shadowy figure stood at the edge of the frame, barely discernible but undeniably there. The photographer frowned, recalling the moment the picture was taken. They had been alone. "Hello, everyone. I am the late-night storyteller, a night owls. It's time for another tale to accompany your journey to dreamland. Like the video, subscribe, and tell me where and when you listen. Let's get started." It began on a gray Saturday morning at a bustling flea market. Amid rows of vintage trinkets and dusty relics, an amateur photographer stumbled upon an old, weathered camera. Its metal casing was scratched, the lens slightly smudged, but it held an undeniable charm. The vendor, an elderly man with a cryptic smile, claimed it was a rare find. "They don't make them like this anymore," he said. "For you? Just $20. But be careful. Some things are better left untouched." Brushing off the warning as a harmless quirk, the photographer paid and left, eager to test their new treasure. Intrigued but not alarmed, the photographer took more photos over the next few days. The shadowy figure reappeared each time. The shadowy figure reappeared, growing clearer and closer with every frame. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light or a flaw in the camera, but as the figure became more defined, a deep unease began. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a human shape, indistinct but undeniably malevolent. Seeking reassurance, the photographer showed the pictures to a friend. "This is unsettling," the friend said, studying the images. "Maybe it's just a defect. Cameras this old can be unpredictable." "But why does it keep moving closer?" the photographer whispered, their voice trembling. That night, as they lay in bed, a faint sound broke the silence. A camera shutter clicking in the distance. The photographer sat up, heart pounding. The camera was in another room, yet the sound persisted. Summoning courage, they crept to where the camera was stored. It lay motionless on the table. But when they opened it, a new photograph awaited them. In it, the shadowy figure filled the frame, its blurred face hinting at a sinister smile. Panic set in. The photographers decided to rid themselves of the cursed object. They drove to a nearby river, hurling the camera into the rushing waters. Relieved, they returned home, convinced the ordeal was over. But the next morning, the camera was on their doorstep, dry and untouched. A note was taped to its side. "You can't escape." Desperation turned to dread. The photographer began to feel watched, even in the safety of their home. Shadows seemed to move in the corners of their vision. Objects shifted when they weren't looking. The camera's presence was suffocating, a constant reminder of their growing terror. They tried smashing it, burning it, burying it, but the camera always returned, unscathed. One fateful evening, in a final act of defiance, the photographer aimed the camera at a mirror and pressed the shutter. They saw the shadow. The camera aimed the camera at a mirror and pressed the shutter. The place illuminated the room for a split second. When the film was developed, the photograph revealed the shadowy figure standing directly behind them, its outstretched hand reaching for their shoulder. Its frightening height and the shadowy figure behind this figure. The photographer disappeared the next day. Neighbors reported strange noises and flickering lights in the house, but no trace of the photographer was ever found. The only item left behind was the camera, sitting innocently on the kitchen table. Months later, the camera resurfaced at the same flea market, its haunting legacy unknown to its next unsuspecting owner. The vendor, the same elderly man with a cryptic smile, placed it prominently on his stall. "A rare find," he murmured to a passing customer. "They don't make them like this anymore." Some say the camera's curse still lingers, moving from one victim to the next. Others claim it's just a story, a warning to avoid meddling with things we don't understand. But one question remains. If you found the camera, would you dare to take a picture? As the train emerged from the fog, its headlights pierced through the gloom, illuminating the station with a ghostly glow. The engine was old and weathered, with rust streaks running down its sides. It screeched to a halt, the sound grating against her nerves. The doors hissed open, revealing a shadowy interior. A conductor stepped out, his uniform tattered and worn, his face pale and gaunt. He tipped his hat in her direction. "All aboard the Midnight Express," he said, his voice carrying an unsettling resonance. "Destination? Uncertain." Emily hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back, but she had nowhere else to go. Taking a deep breath, she stepped onto the train. The doors closed behind her with a loud thud, sealing her fate. Inside, the train was dimly lit by flickering bulbs hanging from the ceiling. The air was heavy, filled with an almost imperceptible hum that vibrated through her chest. She moved down the narrow aisle, glancing at the passengers. They were a peculiar assortment of people. An elderly man clutching a pocket watch, a woman in a Victorian dress mumbling to herself, and a young boy staring blankly out the window. Each seemed lost in their own world, barely acknowledging her presence. Emily found a seat near the back and sank into it, her suitcase on her lap. The train jolted forward, picking up speed far quicker than she anticipated. She looked out the window, expecting to see the familiar landscape of countryside or city lights. Instead, there was nothing but a swirling black void. It was as if the train was traveling through an abyss. "You shouldn't have come," a soft voice said beside her. Startled, Emily turned to see the boy from earlier. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, yet his voice carried a weight far beyond his years. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he turned back to the window, his expression unreadable. Emily felt a chill run down her spine. Something about this train was deeply wrong. Hours seemed to pass, though the train's old clock remained stuck at midnight. Emily watched as the other passengers began to exhibit strange behaviors. The old man with the pocket watch would occasionally mutter in a language she didn't recognize, his eyes darting nervously around the cabin. The woman in the Victorian dress laughed softly to herself, a sound that sent shivers through Emily's body. "Every journey requires a sacrifice," he replied cryptically. "Choose wisely, or the train will choose for you." Emily stumbled back to her seat, her mind racing. What kind of nightmare had she stepped into? The passengers' behaviors grew more erratic. The old man's chanting grew louder, his pocket watch glowing faintly. The Victorian woman's laughter turned into sobs, her dress shifting as though alive. The boy, however, remained eerily calm, watching her intently. "You have to make a choice," he said softly, breaking the silence. "What choice?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone has to stay," he replied. "It's the only way the rest of us can move on." Before Emily could respond, the train shuddered violently, the lights flickered, and the air grew thick with a suffocating pressure. Shadows emerged from the walls, their elongated forms twisting and writhing. One by one, the passengers began to vanish, their screams echoing through the cabin. As the train sped on, Emily's unease grew. She decided to approach the conductor for answers. Making her way toward the front of the train, she passed through several carriages, each more unsettling than the last. In one, the seats were empty except for shadows that moved independently of any figure. In another, the walls seemed to pulse, as though the train itself were alive. When she finally reached the conductor, he was standing stiffly by the controls, his skeletal hands gripping the levers. He turned to her with an unsettling smile. "What is this place?" she demanded. "Where is this train going?" The conductor's smile widened, revealing unnaturally sharp teeth. "This train," he said, "carries those who have lost their way. Souls who wander too long find themselves here, traveling to their final destination. Only one will leave this ride." Emily's heart pounded. "What do you mean, only one?" The old man was the first to go, his pocket watch falling to the floor as he dissolved into nothingness. The Victorian woman followed, her dress unraveling like thread in the wind. Emily watched in horror as the boy stood, his face now devoid of emotion. "It's your turn," he said. The train's whistle pierced the air, louder than ever. Emily found herself paralyzed, unable to move as the shadows closed in. The conductor appeared once more, his skeletal form towering over her. "Decide," he commanded. "Sacrifice or be sacrificed." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she looked at the boy. "Why me? I didn't ask for this." "No one does," the boy replied. "But only one can leave. Choose, or the train will choose for you." Desperation overtook her. She thought about her life, all the mistakes she'd made, the people she'd hurt. Was this her punishment? Did she deserve to stay behind so someone else could move on? The train screeched to an abrupt halt, sparks flying as it ground to a stop. The darkness outside the window began to shift, revealing faint glimpses of a world beyond. Emily realized this was her chance. If she didn't act now, she might never escape. With a cry of determination, she lunged for the boy, pushing him toward the shadows. His face twisted in shock and betrayal as the darkness consumed him. The cabin filled with a deafening roar, and the train began to dissolve around her. When Emily opened her eyes, she was standing on a platform, bathed in sunlight. The fog was gone and the station was bustling with life. Her suitcase lay at her feet untouched. She looked down at her hands, trembling with the weight of what she'd done. The train was gone, and so were the passengers. But in the distance, she heard the faint echo of a whistle, a chilling reminder of the journey she'd survived. As she walked away from the platform, she couldn't shake the feeling that the train hadn't let her go completely. She might have escaped, but the Midnight Express always came back for its own. The night was thick, with a suffocating fog that clung to everything it touched. Tom, a delivery driver in his early 30s, sat slouched in the driver's seat of his aging van. The engine's hum was a lullaby he'd grown used to over the years, a monotonous rhythm that carried him through countless late-night shifts. His coffee was lukewarm and bitter, far from the comfort it once provided at the start of the evening. The GPS on the dashboard flickered faintly, its robotic voice guiding him through the winding roads of a nearly forgotten neighborhood. "Turn left in 500 meters, the GPS droned, its tone devoid of warmth or urgency. Tom squinted through the windshield, the fog swallowing the faint glow of his headlights. The clock on the dashboard read 11:47 p.m. He sighed, rubbing his eyes. "My God, hello?" Tom called, his voice shaky. "Mr. Crow?" Still nothing. The air that seeped from the house was damp and cold, carrying a faint smell of mildew and decay. Tom hesitated. Every instinct screamed at him to leave the package on the doorstep and go, but a nagging sense of obligation kept him rooted. Reluctantly, he stepped inside. The wooden floor groaned under his weight as he crossed the threshold. His phone's flashlight pierced the darkness, casting long, jagged shadows on the walls. Dust motes danced in the beam of light, and the house seemed to close in around him. He set the package down on a small dusty table near the entrance. "I'll just leave this here," he said aloud, more for his reassurance than anything else. As he turned to leave, a faint whisper stopped him in his tracks. "Great," Tom said sarcastically, grabbing the package from the passenger seat. It was small and unremarkable, wrapped in plain brown paper with a name scrawled across the top, Mr. Crow. As he stepped out of the van, the cold night air bit at his skin. The gravel crunched under his boots, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. He approached the house, hesitating at the bottom of the creaking wooden steps. Knocking twice, he called out, "Delivery for Mr. Crow." There was no response. Tom shifted uncomfortably, glancing back at the van. Its faintly humming engine felt like a tether to the real world, a fragile connection he was reluctant to sever. He knocked again, harder this time. The door creaked open, just a crack, but enough to make him jump. He peered inside. The interior was shrouded in darkness, with only the faint outlines of furniture visible against the gloom. Just one more drop-off, then I'm done for the night, he muttered, trying to summon the energy to keep going. The van's tires crunched over gravel as he turned onto a narrow, overgrown road. Trees loomed on either side like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches reaching out as if to ensnare him. The streetlights had disappeared, leaving him alone in the oppressive darkness. Finally, the GPS announced his arrival. "You have reached your destination," it said flatly. Tom slowed the van to a stop in front of a decrepit house. Its facade was a patchwork of rotting wood and peeling paint, and the windows were dark, their curtains drawn like heavy eyelids. The only sign of life was a weak flickering porch light that barely illuminated the front steps. He checked the address on the package and then double-checked it against the faded numbers, barely visible on the house. They matched. The voice was barely audible, stretched and distorted like a tape played at the wrong speed. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He swung his flashlight around, but the beam revealed only empty corners and decaying furniture. Heart pounding, he moved toward the door, his pace quickening. Then he saw it. Hanging on the wall was a large, ornate mirror. His reflection stared back at him. But something was wrong. The figure in the mirror was smiling, a wide, unnatural grin that sent chills down his spine. Tom wasn't smiling. "What the hell?" he whispered, frozen in place. The reflection raised a hand and waved, its movement slow and deliberate. Tom's real hand remained at his side. A spider web of cracks began to spread across the mirror's surface, and a low, guttural growl filled the room. Panic overtook him, and he stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The noise seemed to awaken the house itself. The walls groaned, and the air grew heavy with an oppressive presence. Rumors spread quickly among the local delivery drivers. They spoke of a route that didn't appear on any official map, of a house that seemed to call out to the weary and unwary alike. Some claimed it was a prank, others swore it was cursed. But one thing was certain: no one who took the delivery ever came back the same. Tom's disappearance became another ghost story, whispered among drivers during late-night shifts. But for those who'd seen the house and lived to tell the tale, the truth was far more terrifying. The house wasn't just cursed, it was alive, and it hungered for those who dared cross its threshold. And somewhere, in the shadows of a forgotten suburb, the house waits, its doors slightly ajar, its porch light flickering like a beckoning finger. A new delivery is always due. On the floor, scattered haphazardly, were old photographs. John knelt, picking them up one by one. They depicted a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. Their faces were stiff with the formality of the era, yet their eyes seemed to follow him, filled with something he couldn't quite place. As he flipped through the images, his breath caught in his throat. The last photograph was of him. He stared at it, his mind racing. It was unmistakably him, standing in front of the very house he was in now. But the photograph was aged, the edges yellowed and curling. Judging by the style of the clothing and the sepia tone, it had to be decades old. Yet there he was, unchanged, staring back at himself. A sudden noise snapped him out of his trance. The sound of footsteps coming from behind. He spun around, but the attic was empty. His heart pounded as the bulb flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness before steadying again. The photographs on the floor began to move, as if stirred by an unseen force. One by one, they fluttered into the air, circling him like leaves caught in a whirlwind. "Hello?" he called, his voice breaking the silence. It echoed faintly before being swallowed by the vast emptiness. There was no response. He pushed the door open, its rusted hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of mildew and dust. Cobwebs draped the corners of the ceiling, and the once polished wooden floors were scuffed and littered with debris. Furniture, cloaked in tattered sheets, stood like forgotten ghosts of a bygone era. John's footsteps echoed as he ventured further into the house. Each creak of the floorboards beneath his weight felt like a warning. He moved from room to room, drawn deeper by an inexplicable pull. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, peeling at the edges, revealing scars of water damage and time. It wasn't until he ascended the creaking staircase and found himself in the attic that his sense of unease turned to outright fear. The attic was dimly lit, a single bulb swaying gently from the ceiling, casting long, flickering shadows. The air was colder here, and the smell of decay was stronger. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of amber and crimson, John navigated the winding road that snaked through the countryside. The old highway was a route he'd been warned about, a place spoken of in hushed tones by the locals. Stories of strange occurrences and vanishing travelers kept most people away, but John wasn't most people. Driven by curiosity and a penchant for the eerie, he decided to see for himself the infamous house on the outskirts of town. The road grew narrower as the trees thickened, their gnarled branches interlocking overhead like skeletal fingers. The further he drove, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, flickering just out of sight. The faint hum of his car's engine was the only sound, amplified by the deafening silence of the woods. Panic set in. John stumbled backward, tripping over a forgotten trunk. He hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. The photographs continued their ghostly dance, then abruptly fell to the floor, lifeless. The room was silent once more, save for John's ragged breathing. When he came to, he was no longer in the attic. He was back in his car, the engine idling. His head throbbed, and his vision was blurry. For a moment, he thought he had dreamed the entire ordeal. But the sight of the house standing before him, its ominous presence unyielding, told him otherwise. The front door was now closed, and the oppressive silence had returned. John didn't hesitate. He shifted the car into gear and sped away, the gravel spraying under his tires. He didn't stop until he was miles away, the lights of the city a welcome sight. He never spoke of the house again, but it haunted his dreams. The image of that photograph burned into his memory. Years later, John's car was found abandoned on the same winding road. The authorities searched for him, but found no trace. Inside the car, on the passenger seat, was a single photograph. It depicted the old house, its silhouette as foreboding as ever. Standing in front of it was John, but his eyes were black as coal, and his twisted smile sent chills down the spine of everyone who saw it. After what felt like an eternity, the trees parted, revealing the house. It stood atop a slight rise, its silhouette stark against the twilight sky. Once a grand mansion, it now seemed to sag under the weight of neglect. The paint had long since peeled away, leaving bare wood that was weathered and gray. Windows, their glass cracked or missing entirely, stared back like empty eyes, and the front porch sagged dangerously, as though weary of holding its own weight. As John parked his car on the graveled driveway, the crunch of stones under his tires breaking the eerie quiet. He stepped out, the cool evening air prickling his skin. The house loomed ahead, drawing him in like a moth to a flame. As he approached, he noticed the front door was ajar, swinging slightly with the breeze. The sight sent a shiver down his spine.